You know, several days ago, I posted on some internet channels regarding freeze drying that I'm a member of, a couple projects that I had done for freeze drying and putting together bagged meals, and I got some real good response from both of them. But I also got a lot of questions about a lot of different things, a lot of different procedures, that I decided to go ahead and produce this video that I might answer some of those questions, and also when I'm finished, show you what I put together here, exactly how I did it, and what the end results were. I'm Evan Rowell, and this is Critical Thinking, about questions and answers regarding freeze-drying techniques. Okay. The first thing that I want to do is something that I have produced a video for a couple of months back regarding what it means to be dry and exactly how it is you can determine what is dry and what is not. Specifically, I want to talk about how to save time and energy and how a freeze dryer lacks in certain abilities and how a dehydrator also lacks in certain abilities, but how, if you use them in concert, you can save time, you can save energy, and you can alleviate any concerns you might have about whether or not your food is absolutely dry. But the first thing I want to do is I want to address an issue about a dehydrator and what most people will fear when it comes to a dehydrator because of some scientific reports that are out there. Specifically, there's one that says that a freeze dryer only dries to about 98%, which is plenty sufficient for long-term storage. But then it turns right around and says the dehydrator will only do 80%, which for me, you're not considering something as far as that statement goes. Okay? And what I mean by that is that when a dehydrator starts to dehydrate food, it is capable of dehydrating and removing 100% of the water out of whatever it is you're dehydrating. The problem with that is, and the reason that they say 80%, is once you remove more than 80% of the water in a dehydrator, you might as well just turn off your dehydrator and throw the food away, because it is so dry, it is so hard, it is so brittle, and it is so extremely difficult to rehydrate. And then when you do rehydrate it, if you do manage to do it, it never returns to its original state. You'd be very disappointed with it. So anybody that does any dehydrating exclusively knows that you don't want to dehydrate your food 100%. You want to dehydrate it no more than 80% so that the finished product can come out and be stored for an extended period of time. You know, for 2 or 3 years if it's properly packaged, but not long term because it still has 20% water in it. Okay, so when you see those reports that decrying, oh no, you can't use a dehydrator, you certainly can. And I'm going to illustrate that here in just a minute when I'm finished with this little section here. I'm going to show you some pictures of something that was very interesting that happened with something that I was freeze drying and then ended up needing to put in the dehydrator. But anyhow, when you put food in a dehydrator, initially, while it's still wet and everything, and you dehydrate it, like I say, it'll dehydrate it down into little rocks. It'll shrivel it up. It'll petrify it, okay? But that doesn't mean that a dehydrator can't be used in concert with a freeze dryer, because a freeze dryer, it freezes material and it begins to sublimate the ice off of it. And because it's frozen, the material doesn't shrivel, it doesn't shrink, it doesn't lose its vitamin content, it never goes above 152 degrees, which will deactivate enzymes. But once you see that temperature rise above 60, 70, 80 degrees, it means that sublimation has finished. It means there's no more ice in there. And then your freeze dryer has basically become a giant dehydrator that happens to be in a vacuum. But the problem with that is that moisture, and remember, by this time there's no more ice, it's all water. And moisture, however, in food that is partially dried already, will try to distribute itself in amongst the material, and it makes it very, very hard for the freeze dryer to eliminate that little bit of moisture and that vapor because it's inside the food, okay, and it wants to stay there and the food wants to hold on to it. So basically, with a freeze dryer, after sublimation has stopped and the temperature of the trays rise really, really high, it may take twice as long. It may take, you know, if it took 8 hours for the sublimation to finish, it may take another 8 to 12 to 16 hours to get rid of that last little bit of moisture. And that is where the dehydrator comes in, because there's no getting around it. A freeze dryer is the best way to produce food that you can store for a long time, hands down. I wouldn't try to use a dehydrator exclusively. The freeze dryer is the way to go. But once the freeze dryer has done its job, once the freeze dryer is trying to get rid of that last little bit of moisture, what happens is the food's physical characteristics have been set. The size, the color, the nutrients, and everything is set. Once it dries any further than that, you're not going to shrivel it, you're not going to shrink it, as long as all you're trying to do is get rid of water vapor or cold spots, okay? And so I always let my freeze dryer go all the way to the end of the drying process. All right, I never cancel it before the end of the drying process. But as soon as it jumps into extra dry time, I cancel the cycle. I open it up and I inspect the food. And you know, 95% of the time the food is finished. It is perfectly dry. It is good to package. Okay, sometimes I'll get cold spots, sometimes I'll get water vapor. And sometimes I'll still get wet spots. And if I have wet spots, I add more dry time in the freeze dryer. I put the food back in the freeze dryer and let the freeze dryer handle the wet spot. Because if I were to take the food and put it in the dehydrator at that point, those wet spots would shrivel. Okay, those wet spots would become little hard as rock stones in amongst the good freeze-dried food. So I never try to use a dehydrator to get rid of wet spots. But if all you have is cold spot and water vapor, and what it is, that's the water vapor inside of the food will cause it so that when you touch the area and maybe scratch it a little bit, it won't be hard, it won't be crispy like the rest of the food, but it won't feel wet. And when that happens, you know that you've got vapor moisture. And the food is holding on to that, and the freeze dryer has a very difficult time, even under a vacuum, removing that. That's why sometimes you need to let your food go all the way through the extra dry time before that's gone. Well, what I'll do is I'll take the food out and I'll turn it over in the pan and I'll put it in a dehydrator, and that water vapor in the dehydrator is very quickly evacuated because you've got moving warm air. Now, the key to being successful at that is to make sure that you are the one that stops the dehydrator. You never want to let your food sit in there and get cool, because the process will reverse itself. The food in the dehydrator, once it becomes cool, it becomes it'll start to pull the air in from the atmosphere, and that can happen very, very quickly. So that is the difference. I do not use the dehydrator to completely remove all the water. I don't use it to remove any water. I use it to remove the vapor and the cold spots from food that come out of the freeze dryer, instead of letting the freeze dryer and the vacuum pump and everything else run for another 6 or 7 or 8 hours to do what a dehydrator will do very, very quickly. Now I'm going to show you this picture. But before I do, I want to give you a little backstory to this. A while back, I did a batch, and my wife had opened up a big number 10 can of string beans because she was making some minestrone soup, and we didn't have any small cans, but she needed it, so she opened it up, and I said, that's okay, just go ahead, and I will freeze dry the rest of it. And so by the time she finished using the green beans, the cut green beans that she wanted, I took and drained them and put them in a pan. There wasn't enough to fill up 2 pans, but there was enough to fill up 1 pan. It was quite full. And it just so happens that the other 3 pans I filled up with asparagus, so they were really thin. So I had 3 pans of asparagus and 1 pan of cut string beans that was very full. And I went ahead and I ran that, and it ran through the entire batch. It went into final dry time, And this was a good example to let you know that even when it hits final dry time, there still may be some moisture left. And because I had so many green beans in the pan, I took it out and I noticed that the top of the pan was completely dry. It had freeze-dried very well, but there were some wet green beans underneath. Now normally I would have put them back in the freeze dryer and put it on more dry time, but I thought to myself, I really don't want to do this just for one pan, have my machine running for another 8 hours just for one pan. So I decided, well, let's see what happens. I'm going to put this in the dehydrator. Okay? So I took it and I put it in 2 trays of the dehydrator and I finished it off in the dehydrator. And yes, I was able to remove 100% of the water from a dehydrator. And anybody that thinks that you can't remove 100% of water from a dehydrator is thinking erroneously. That warm air passing over that food eventually, if you let it run long enough, will pull all the water out of there, but it'll destroy it. It'll destroy whatever it is that it is dehydrating because it'll shrivel up, it'll become hard, and extremely difficult to rehydrate. So now I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here. When I pull the beans out of the dehydrator, I noticed something very interesting, and it is very, very telling. Okay? Now look at this picture. You see 4 pieces of the green beans. The one at the top is one that was fully freeze-dried when it came out of the freeze dryer. The next 2 were half and half. You'll notice on the ends, it's not shriveled. It is actually still its original size, its original shape, and everything. But the middle of that string bean, on the 2 middle ones there, it was still wet, and those are the sections that dried in the dehydrator. All right, and then the bottom one was one that was completely wet, and it dried completely in the dehydrator. And you can see that all 4 of these beans went through 2.5 to 3 hours in the dehydrator to finish off and to dry out what water was left in there. And you'll notice the dehydrator didn't affect what was completely freeze-dried, because in the freeze dryer, that top green bean was completely freeze-dried. Its shape, its density, its physical characteristics were set in the freeze dryer, and so the dehydrator had no effect on it. All right. Now, as you can see from the middle ones, the dehydrator did have an effect on only the wet part of the green bean. It only shriveled that up, leaving the end pieces, which were freeze-dried, with their original characteristics. And of course, that bottom one shows what happens to that same green bean after it's been dehydrated, start to finish. So there you have it. I would never depend on my dehydrator for long-term storage. However, I also understand that a freeze dryer sublimates the ice off of the food fairly quickly within the first 6 or 7 or 8 hours. And then the tray temperature raises way up because the freeze dryer essentially becomes a giant expensive dehydrator in a vacuum. And because it's trying to dehydrate water now and the food is holding on to it, it can take hours and hours and hours that you don't have to spend freeze drying, when you can take the food out and there's no visible water and put it into a dehydrator. Now, some people will go, well, shoot, you know, I had somebody years ago that packaged a lot of food that, you know, they didn't think that there was enough moisture in there. They thought it was completely dry and everything. And after 5 years, the food was no good and they had to throw it all away. Well, I think that's baloney. If somebody packaged food that went bad after 5 years, you can be sure that they packaged it with water in it. Okay, they did not package it properly, or they did not package it in something that would not permeate oxygen or moisture. They did something wrong. Okay, because I want to ask you something here. I got here a saltine cracker. Now this saltine cracker is dry. At least you might think it was, but did you know that if you can test, that they have scientific methods of testing something as dry as saltine crackers, and they'll find a water content in it. But for me, this saltine cracker, if it hadn't been sitting out for as long as it has, you can actually feel that it's starting to absorb a little bit of moisture from the air. But a saltine cracker, fresh out of the package, that is absolutely dry, is good to go, only there's going to be some moisture in it. Now, it is true that there are three great destroyers of food. What makes it go bad? The first, of course, is moisture. The second is oxygen, and the third is heat, and particularly in that order. Did you know that water is a solvent and that oxygen is corrosive? If you don't believe me, just it's oxygen and water together that cause rust in metal. And then heat can cause things to change chemically. Okay, so if you remove all three of those components from food, I ask you, what do you think is going to make the food go bad? All right, what is it about the food? Is it suddenly after 25 years, there's some little clock in there going, okay, 25 years, it's time to disintegrate. It's time to go bad. It's time to, bacteria is not going to do anything because bacteria needs that moisture. And incidentally, like I said with this cracker, there is some moisture in there. But can bacteria grow in that? Not at the level of moisture it is when it is first produced and baked and absolutely dry. And ask yourself, if you were in the Mojave Desert and you were there for a long time without water and you died from thirst, is your body, at the moment of that you die, is your body have any water in it? Yes, of course it does, but it doesn't have enough to survive. Okay? And bacteria is the same way. Bacteria has a way of encapsulating itself so that it can live through extremely dry conditions. And then years later, when the conditions are moist enough, it will come back. I don't know how it does it, but I know I have studied and I have read reports that talk about bacteria. People will ask, can you freeze dry a piece of meat? Will it kill the bacteria? And the answer is no. That bacteria somehow is able to go into stasis or hibernation, or I'm not sure exactly how it does it, but it's able to encapsulate itself and maintain a moisture level that is sufficient to keep it from dying. And then 25 years later, when moisture comes along and dissolves it or intermingles with that bacteria is alive again and able to proliferate. But while it's in a freeze-dried state, it can't proliferate, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Okay? So this is what we have to be careful of. It's getting so caught up in people saying this and saying that and saying the other and making this claim and making that claim. You have to be careful. You have to understand that water levels, although 100% reduction in water levels is important, number one, it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. But you can get it down to a point where bacteria cannot grow, where bacteria goes into hibernation or stasis or whatever it is. I'm not sure. But I do know that it doesn't kill it, but it stops it from growing. Okay? And so what you need to do, and I have a meter that I actually use. It's not expensive. It's called a Prexiso, Prexiso. And I've had people go, well, Evan, that's for measuring moisture in wood, that's for measuring moisture in drywall and even on concrete and other things. But when I got it, I'm sitting here, and I set this thing to on, this thing will measure the moisture in my finger. There's 30% in my finger. It'll measure moisture in a hot dog. It'll measure moisture in a piece of dry meat. As a matter of fact, I dried some Parmesan cheese, and what I did was I packed it down into a little cake, and I was able to measure about 1% moisture in it. And I dry Parmesan cheese in my dehydrator because it doesn't shrink up, it doesn't do anything, it happens very, very quickly. And after the dehydrator had been drying that for a couple of hours, I took it out and packed it down into a little cake, and I read it with my meter, and it read 0. Okay, it wouldn't read any moisture in it. That's good to go. Fact of the matter is, I'm sure some lab someplace could take that same cheese and put it on their machines and read 0.001 or 0.01 or something like that, moisture in it. And then a lot of people will hear that, and they go, oh, Evan, the cheese wasn't dry. You tried to pack it for 30 years, and dang nabbit, it's just going to ruin everything. That's not true. The fact of the matter is, if you are able to look at the food and you can't detect water in it, you can't feel it, you can't smell it, and it cracks like a cookie and there's no water in it, it's good to go. You can even take your moisture meter and you can stick it in there and see what it says. But if you can't detect the moisture, then it's good to go. And I'll guarantee you that dehydrator can and will, if the food is left in there long enough at the right temperature, it will take out 100% of the water. But then by the time, like I say, by the time you're finished, go to your dehydrator, open it up, turn it off, take the food out, put it in the trash. Because that's about what it's worth. Unless you want to put it in a grinder or a blender or something, make powder out of it, and then use it as a base for soup or something, you can do that. But as far as that goes, your freeze dryer is the way to go if you want to store food, even meat, for a long period of time. All right. Now I'll be happy to answer any more questions that people have about using freeze dryer. I use a Cabela's 12 tray programmable, and you know, sometimes you don't want to dry things at 130 degrees. Okay, you never want to dry food for storage at above 150 degrees, because that's when you start affecting the vitamin content and the enzyme content and that sort of stuff. But sometimes I won't go above 80 degrees, and my criteria for that is sometimes I'll put something in there that will melt, like cheese and dairy products that I want to dry, and make sure that it's completely dry. And if I put it in there at 130 degrees, it actually makes the product that I put in there a little softer, because it begins to melt, not because there's water being added to it. So I'll do 80 degrees for a couple hours, and always when it comes out. And you know, my Parmesan cheese is just that way. I never dry it at really high temperatures for the second half of the drying cycle, and it comes out just dry. It comes out dry like sand, and I'm perfectly satisfied with that. Okay, so there you have it, the difference between a freeze dryer and a dehydrator. Freeze dryer is the way to go, but if you're smart and you want to shave a lot of time off of your freeze dryer time, and all you have left on the food is vapor moisture and cold spots, take that food and put it in a dehydrator for an hour, and it will rid that food of those vapor moisture and those cold spots within many times less than an hour, because there's no liquid in the food, but you remove the rest of that. So I never use the dehydrator initially, but I will use it to help mop up what the freeze dryer has a very difficult time doing. Okay, so one of the other questions that I get a lot of from a lot of different people is the use of these plastic bags. And they say, oh, Evan, those plastic bags, if you've ever seen one outside, just sitting out after a fairly, maybe a year and a half, those plastic bags will begin to break down, and that'll affect the food, and it'll leach into the food and everything. And I've heard that time and time again. But again, people aren't paying attention to what is really happening here. Did you know that this same plastic bag, there's a big economic argument going on about this type of plastic in these bags and in jugs and bottles and containers and everything going into landfills and lasting 400 years. And so why is it that a bag will break down outside in the garbage, laying in a field someplace after just a year and a half, 2 years, but inside a landfill, that same bag won't break down for 400 years? Well, the answer to the question is really simple. You got to ask yourself, what breaks down a plastic bag? And the answer to that question is primarily sunlight. Light, and then after that is heat. Water is kind of on the bottom of the scale when it comes to deteriorating one of these bags. They have found bags at the bottom of the ocean that were devoid of heat and sunlight that were still in good shape after years and years and years. So water isn't going to affect these, but heat and light is what breaks down these plastic bags. I covered my greenhouse outside with some HDPE plastic film that lasted about a year before we had a big windstorm that just ripped it to shreds. because the light and the heat began to deteriorate it. I have since replaced it with other material, translucent material that works very, very well. But I learned constantly that these plastic bags, once they are put inside of a Mylar bag and vacuum packed, will last forever without affecting the food. However, something like this is bottled water in a plastic container. I don't mind this as long as that plastic container hasn't been put, left exposed to heat and left outside. I found one of these in my car one time that was down in the side of the door that had been there for a long time. And I knew by holding it that because it was left out in the sunlight and the heat, that's when the plastic starts to break down and the plastic can actually leach into the water, and that's not good. So I never leave my water bottles. My wife likes these. She thinks there's a big difference between these and what comes out of the tap, and there's not really, but you know, she's adamant about it, so I go ahead and humor her that way. But if water has been left out in the sunlight, especially if you put it on the dash of your car, and where it's been heat and sunlight has been really intense, after a couple of days, throw it away. Because if you drink that water, even if you cool it off again, you're drinking leached plastic, and it's very, very bad for you. Okay? So anyhow, I have absolutely no qualms about packaging up food to keep it separate. You know, here I have the mashed potatoes, and I have the hamburger, and I have the vegetables and the Parmesan cheese, all in separate plastic bags, and they'll all go into this larger bag as a meal in a bag kit. And I'm going to show you exactly how I do that. But I have no problem with that, okay, using those bags. And also, some people will go, Evan, doggone it, if you put it in a plastic bag inside it more than 2 weeks, it's going to leach enough water and oxygen and everything to destroy the food that's in it. And you know, and that's baloney. That is absolute baloney. I have had food in, like these meatballs here, for 2 and maybe as long as 3 weeks. I never go more than 2. Because, you know, there is, you know, you never know. But here I've got spaghetti sauce. Here I've got mashed potatoes. And it's not a problem, especially when the food's coming out of a dehydrator. You take it out of the dehydrator while it's warm. If you let it sit in the air, that warm food is going to start to suck moisture right out of the air. So immediately I put it in these gallon freezer bags, primarily because it allows the food to cool without drawing moisture in from the surrounding air. And believe me, the air that might be inside of the bag is nowhere near enough to affect the dryness of the food. So I'll put it in these if it's going to sit for any length of time. As a matter of fact, I'll put it in these even if I'm going to package it in Mylar bags the same day. Because it's just a line of defense that you use to keep your warm food from absorbing moisture. Okay, and then I'll put an oxygen absorber just inside the bag. You can see them here in this hamburger and onion mix. And that's when it goes into the Mylar bag, it'll have oxygen absorbers in it. So that is answering the questions about plastic bags. They're perfectly safe to use. They're not going to break down. They're not going to, after a year, suddenly some time clock bomb goes off and the bag is suddenly going to dissolve like you just put cotton candy in water. It's not going to happen. If you have complete dryness inside the bag, there's no sunlight, there's no heat, that bag, like I say, in a landfill, will last 400 years. So that kind of answers that question. Now, let's talk about expiration dates. A lot of people, and my wife is one of them, she is absolutely afraid of expiration dates. If something is approaching its expiration date or best buy date, that you need to throw it out. And I have the hardest time convincing her that that expiration date is put in place with the consideration of how it's packaged. Okay? You take a package of something with a best buy or an expiration date on it, and you open it up, that expiration date goes right out the window. All of a sudden, it's cut in half. Once you've got something opened up and you put it in the refrigerator, as a matter of fact, that's why it says refrigerate after opening sometimes, is because once you open it up, you have exposed it to more oxygen and moisture from the air than there was when it was packaged. One of the prime examples of that is flour. They say that flour, when you buy it in the package, can have up to a year shelf life before it starts to show signs of moisture and deterioration. But once you open it, that goes down to 2 to 3 months. So expiration dates generally have to do with how the product is packaged. If it's wet, then an expiration date may be something to consider. Or if it's dry, it's not packaged for long-term storage. And it will easily permeate outside oxygen, outside moisture, and air, and cause the food to deteriorate inside the package. Those little cardboard boxes and those little foil, wax paper containers inside of there, they are a very poor defense against moisture and oxygen, and they're not vacuum packed. Okay, as a matter of fact, this has been several years ago, and I don't remember who did it. It was some university study or something, but they came across a can of corn that was 40 years old. Okay, this is a can of corn. Now you can imagine if you took a can of corn out of Walmart, it's got an expiration date of maybe 2 years, sometimes 3 years. But this can of corn was 40 years old, and they opened it up, and the corn was still good. They were still able to consume it. There was nothing poison about it. There was nothing broke down about it. They said it was perfectly fine after 40 years. Okay, so when something is properly canned, even if it's wet, you destroy the bacteria that's in it, and you deprive it of any more oxygen, you deprive it of any heat and sunlight. It will last for a long, long time. Now, I don't recommend that. I'm not saying that's going to always be the case, because, you know, botulism is something that you want to watch out for. If you come across a case of food that's 10, 20, 30 years old, you be very, very careful with it. I'm not advocating that you say, oh, well, Evan says this is okay, so open it up and eat it. Don't. Okay? Be sure. Use your senses. Use your nose. Take a look at it. If there's something wrong with that food, you'll be able to tell by opening up that can. Now, as far as packaged food lasting 20, 30, even 40 or more years, the question I got is, if it's properly packaged, what's going to cause the food to go bad? Okay, you don't have any oxygen, you don't have any moisture, you don't have any sunlight, you don't have any heat. What is it that's going to cause the food to go bad? What's going to cause this hamburger to suddenly decide that it's not going to be hamburger anymore, it's going to become dust, or it's going to act like it's been eaten and pooped out by bacteria or something? If there's nothing to destroy the food or change its physical characteristics, it's not going to change. Okay? It's just not. And to give you an example of that, again, I can't cite the source. You're going to have to look it up. But there was it was a college or a research group or somebody found a package of K-rations. K-rations were military rations that predated World War II. Back when they first started doing this, somebody found some and they opened it up. Now these K-rations, they were crackers and peanut butter and dried, you know, whatever it is that they were packaging for soldiers all the way back before World War II. And that's been, what, 70, 80 years ago? And they opened them up, and they were good. They were fine. They didn't suddenly, after 25 or 30 years, suddenly explode and disintegrate, and there wasn't something to make them go bad. So when food is properly stored, it is properly freeze-dried, it is properly dried, I should say, and stored and vacuum packed, it will last a very, very long time. And the reason that, you know, companies that package stuff say it's good for 25 years, most of that has to do with liability. Okay, they don't want somebody opening up a package after 26 years and then preparing it wrong or letting it sit out or do something with it and have it go bad and make them sick, and then they come back and say, well, the package says 25 years, you know, or 24 years, and they did something wrong. So they always put an expiration date on food. If you'll notice, most food that is freeze-dried and packaged, it's very, very expensive, but you can find it in stores, and it is for camping and rehydrating and doing whatever it is, and eating outdoors without having to cook it. It's never vacuum packed, or at least very seldom is it vacuum packed, and there's very little of it, and it has all kinds of additives in it and preservatives to make the food last longer and taste better, and they have an expiration date. It's usually 20 to 25 years, but my personal belief, and you have to be responsible this way. You have to decide for yourself what you're going to do and what you're going to accept and what you're not going to accept. But my experience in studying this stuff and trying to find out what it is that people believe is going to make food go bad after 25 years, because by golly, if it's lasted 25 years, I believe it'll last a lot longer. But you're going to have to decide for yourself. So this is a big disclaimer. Don't pay attention to what I'm telling you. Okay, I'm just telling you what has been my experience. And my experience is that if it lasts 25 years, it'll last 45 years. Okay? But you have to decide for yourself. You have to make that determination. I'm not going to be responsible if you do something wrong with packaged food and 20 years later you open it up and it's bad because you let too much moisture get into the bag, or the bag had an opening in it or something which was allowing moisture and oxygen in, and yada yada yada, and there's a lot of things that you can do wrong. But if you do it right, you'll have food to last you for it'll outlast you, really. I don't care how old you are. Okay, another question that I often get, people see that I'm packaging, flaked mashed potatoes here, and they say, well, Evan, how do you prepare your potatoes? And my answer to that is I never freeze-dry potatoes because it's not cost-effective. It's cheaper and just as good to buy them. I have cases of number 10 cans in my pantry that I bought for, less than $5 a case. And that number 10 can would take a whole batch worth to do what I have in one number 10 can, and that means that considering a batch costs between $5 and $7 and takes wear and tear on my machine, and it takes a couple of days to do, just so that I can accomplish the same thing that I've got in a number 10 can of potatoes, and they will last for years and years and years. So I never do potatoes, and that goes for these potatoes right here. Now I've packaged, in this package, I've got mashed potatoes, I've got hamburger gravy, I've got vegetables, mixed vegetables, brown gravy, Parmesan cheese. I've got all of that, and these are Hungry Jack. Let's see if I got the box. No, I don't got the box. My wife is taking the box away. But these are just Hungry Jack potatoes, and they're already dry. And again, people will go, well, Evan, there's moisture in Hungry Jack potatoes and everything. There is not enough in this to worry about. This is dry. I can't detect any moisture in this. I can compact this down, and I can put my moisture meter into it, and it'll come up zero. And believe me, I've done that already. I have absolutely no qualms about buying stuff off the shelf that's already dry and using it. When I package spaghetti, I don't cook this first and mix it with the sauce and everything, and then package it. The question is why? Most people will do that because they think about the very, very worst case scenario, that their house is blown up and that they're out on the streets and they got no way to cook anything, and all they have is this one package here, and they open it up and they want to be able to just dump a bunch of water in it, close it up, and half an hour later open it up and eat it. Well, I'm not of that opinion. Okay, I want to prepare for worst case scenarios and everything, but I don't think there's ever going to come a time when I can't boil water. And because these noodles are uncooked, they're already straight and laid in, packed as tight as can be. I can put them in a 1 gallon Harvest Right bag along with the sauce and the meatballs and everything and seal it up. So I never cook anything just to freeze dry it. If I can put it in the bag, in the package, without going through the hassle of adding water and then taking the water away, why would you want to do that? Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes I don't have smaller individual package in my bug-out kit or in other places for specialty uses where I don't do that. where I expect to be someplace where there's going to be no water or no heat, no fire, no nothing to cook the noodles. So I do have some smaller packages, single serving packages, that all you got to do is open them up, pour enough water into them, and the directions are on the package, and then let it sit for a while, and then you can eat it. Okay, so that does have its place, but most of the time I don't cook and then dehydrate what I don't have to. I don't do noodles. I don't do potatoes. Other things that I do are the vegetables. I will buy them frozen in the store and come home and freeze dry them, fresh, frozen. My meatballs, my hamburger, I will of course freeze dry, because you need to freeze dry them. Okay, it's all part of the plan. So with that, I don't cook something just to turn right around and freeze dry it, because I'm afraid of water content. Use your senses. If you can't feel water, if you can't, rub it in your fingers, if there's water in it, you'll be able to tell, because it'll begin to ball up. If you rub it in your fingers and it just crumbles and turns to powder and everything, then you're pretty much good to go. You don't have to worry about it. Some people like to worry about it because they hear what other people say and they read these reports and everything, but trust yourself. You can tell. There's no reason in the world that you won't be able to tell when something's dry enough to use. Rice is another one. I don't cook rice just to turn right around and freeze dry. I do in large bulk if I want to parboil the rice, so that you just add water. And I've got a lot of packages that has cooked rice that's been freeze dried. I've mixed with hamburger and ham or vegetables or whatever else, that all you do have to do is pour water on it and it'll reconstitute. Okay, but a lot of times I've got literally dozens of rice-a-roni meals where I have done hamburger and vegetables and packed it with the rice-a-roni along with the instructions and everything, so that when somebody takes it out, they cook the rice-a-roni. Okay, I may not be, I may not have the most whoop-de-doo oven or source of boiling water or anything, but I really don't care what happens. Even if I have no electricity or gas, I can find a way to boil water. Because if you can't find a way to boil water, then boy, you must really be in dire straits. And I do have some food that will help with that situation too. So with that, let's move on. Okay, the next question that always comes up is, Evan, how do you do meat? How can you be sure that meat is good for long-term storage? Again, use your senses. But the thing that most people are concerned about is the oil in meat. What I got to say about that is, did you know, or have you considered the fact that fat is not the problem with meat? Okay, you can have fat. It's the oil that's in the fat. I have removed the oil from meat before and freeze dried it and had it come out, and the fat is just as crumbly and just as dry as anything as the rest of the meat. So fat's not the problem, it's the oil. And that's the reason that I do not do raw meat anymore. Even the ham, the pre-cooked ham in the stores, I will pressure cook a little bit, because I will inevitably be able to pull more oil off of the fat in ham even than there is if you just slice it up and throw it in a freeze dryer tray. So I always cook. Sometimes I cook in a fry pan. Sometimes I cook in my pressure pot, my power pot, and sometimes I will do it in the oven. The oven is particularly effective at causing that fat to render its oil out and end up in the bottom of the tray. And what I do is that a lot of people ask me, and they say, well, Evan, why do you rinse your meat? Well, I put up some pictures. Here's a picture right here of these meatballs just after they came out of the oven, and you can see what all that grease and oil and everything that's around the outside of the meatballs. That's called tallow. And fact of the matter is, most people would cringe at the thought of washing away all that tallow. My mother taught me how to make gravy out of that stuff, and it is by far the best gravy that you'll ever make. It's far better than the gravy that you'll see in these packages right here. That tallow, that grease, that oil, you can take and make wonderful gravy out of that, and it'll flavor other dishes. You can make your soup stocks out of it and everything. But for my purposes, I wasn't going to save it, so here's another picture of me rinsing that tallow or that oil and fat off of the meatballs, because I didn't want that ending up in the freeze dryer. Okay, I don't want to freeze dry that stuff because it doesn't freeze dry very well. I almost always rinse my meat before freeze drying it. This is hamburger right here. This is 97.3. This is a very lean hamburger. Even this stuff, after I finished cooking it, I fried this, but after I finished cooking it and it was ground up fairly small, I put it in a wire basket, and I rinsed it. Now, people will ask me, they'll say, well, Evan, that washes all the flavor away. Well, you know, that's true. One of the unfortunate truths about meat is that the flavor is in the grease. It's in the fat. And that is why people will be concerned about the marbling in a piece of meat. I like ribeye steaks because it has probably by far the best marbling. If you look at it, you see little tiny lines of marble all throughout the meat. That means when it's cooked, that marbling will flavor the rest of the meat, and that's why it's such a wonderful piece of meat. Filet mignon is just the opposite. Filet mignon is the most flavorless piece of meat in the whole cow. It is the most tender, but any chef will tell you that if you want a good edible filet mignon, the chef has to know how to prepare it so that it maintains its flavor, maintains its desirability as a cut of meat. Okay, you buy a filet mignon for the fact that it is the tenderest piece of meat on the cow. And other pieces of meat, you know, the regular choice rump roast and stuff like that, you look at them and it'll have very large lines of fat all through the meat. Or not all through, but along the meat and around the edges and stuff like that. It's very difficult to prepare so that you don't have to throw most of the fat away. You have to trim it off. By the time you finish trimming off the fat, you've lost a third of the weight of what it is you're buying, and that's why it's a cheaper piece of meat. So that's what I do with meat. I always cook it, and I always rinse it off. Now, to replace the flavor, inside the package with the meat, I will put increased flavoring. I like the bouillon that I will add to the meat before I freeze dry it. Sometimes I'll add spices, garlic, salt, crushed cayenne or something like that, but I always do something to the meat to add flavor back into it because I just washed away all the fat. But if you'll do that, and one of the ways you can tell if your meat is been freeze dried correctly and is ready for storage, just find a little piece of the fat in your meat that made it into the freeze dryer and cut it off and squeeze it. Okay, if you squeeze it, and sometimes you may have to use a pair of pliers, but squeeze that. If you can squeeze any oil out of that meat, then that meat is maybe good for 5 years. Okay, but the fat has to be to a point where if you were to squeeze it between a pair of pliers and squeeze it really hard, that you weren't able to see any glistening gleam of oil come to the surface. Okay, that's why you want to select meat that doesn't have great, big, huge, thick fat lines in it. And if you do, you want to cut those out. You want to chop it up so that you get pieces of lean meat with very little fat on them. And then, like I say, if you cook it and rinse it, that fat, though it is still there, will be okay because you have just rendered the oil out of it, and that's the goal with meat. So again, I used to, but not for very long, do raw meat. You can. Raw meat, you can do raw meat just very, very successfully, very, very fine, but you have to be very, very careful with it. Make sure that you cut it lean. Make sure you choose pieces of beef that don't have fat lines in them that are more than 1/16 of an inch. If you choose raw meat that has a real thick fat line in it, you need to cut that fat line out because you will be freeze drying meat and you'll have oil inside that fat. And that oil will make it go bad very, very quickly, relatively speaking. Okay, so if you want to do raw meat, go ahead. but make sure you learn how to do it and make sure that you do it correctly. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is these meatballs. I had a lot of questions about how I prepared them, and I'm going to show you some pictures of what I did and why they were rinsed, and you'll understand. Now, how I made these was Harvest Right makes a mold. Now, this insert, it has 60 sections on it, and it's made to fit the medium freeze dryer. And right now, Harvest Right is back ordered. It took me about a month to get these once I ordered them. They're very, very popular. And what I did was I mixed up, let's see, it was 7.5, almost 8 pounds of lean ground beef. I put 6 eggs and a pound of breadcrumbs and seasoning and other stuff in it, and I made basically meatloaf mixture. And I was able to fill these up in about 15 minutes. It took me to fill all 4 of them up, and I used the backside of a dough divider, and I was able to spread that around and make sure that they stayed divided. And then I froze them. And people, they wonder why I froze them. Well, that's because I wanted to be able to take them out of this pan, or this mold here, and put them in the pan without them losing their shape. And if they were, you know, still raw, trying to pull them out of here, I'd end up with a, you know, a mass of meat there that wouldn't hold its shape. So I froze them, and after about 8 hours in the freezer, I was able to take these and pop them out. Now here's a picture of them after I took them out and put them in the pan. Now, a lot of people will ask me, and they'll say, Evan, why didn't you just put the silicone in the oven and cook the meat right in the silicone? Well, at the time, I hadn't talked with Harvest Right, and I hadn't asked them if these were oven safe. And the guy that I talked to, he was a salesman, he says, you know, I've never had that question before, let me go ask. So we went to the Harvest Right's owner and asked them, because Harvest Right is the one that makes these, and the owner said it's not recommended. Okay, they weren't made for the oven, they were made for the freeze dryer. But what I know about silicone, 100% silicone, is it will go it'll go anywhere from minus 40 degrees centigrade to 280 some odd degrees centigrade, which is nearly 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And you know, silicone bakeware is quite popular. And I learned that the way you tell if it'll work is if you take a piece of your silicone corner and if you'll twist it, it's supposed to change color. And if it changes color, it's not 100% silicone. So here's a picture where I had actually twisted the edge of the mold, and it turned white. Now, that is supposed to mean that this is not oven safe, because it's not 100% silicone if it turns white. But then again, I want you to see this. This is oven safe. This is my hot dog bun mold here. And I tried the same thing on this. I tried to twist it, and you know, here's a picture. It also turned white. Now, it was more difficult to get this to turn white than it was to get that green one to turn white. The fact of the matter is, they both turned white. And according to, you know, what I learned on the internet, that's an indication of not 100% pure silicone. But again, getting this one to turn white was much more difficult than it was getting this mold to turn white. So I don't know. I have my trepidations. I want to throw that into the oven with something in it and see if it'll damage it or stain it or do whatever. But if it's not made for the oven and it destroys it or it messes it up or something, I've got to buy another set if I want 4 molds, because I don't think Harvest Right sells these one at a time. Plus, I'll have to wait a long time to get it. So anyhow, once I had the meat in the mold and it was frozen, I was able to pop it out, and they maintained their shape. And I put them in the oven, in the freeze dryer trays. Now, the freeze dryer trays are oven safe. They're a good quality pan, and I've used them many times in the oven, and they do just fine. So I popped them out, I put them in the oven, and I cooked them at 375 degrees for 45 minutes. And when they came out, sure enough, there was a lot of oil, there was a lot of tallow, and there was a lot of stuff. So I dumped them into a colander, and I rinsed them in scalding hot water, and then I put them back on the trays and seasoned them. I used garlic salt and chili powder that I grew and freeze-dried and ground up myself. And they turned out really, really well. And then they came out of the freeze dryer. They were just like this. And you know, I took 4 or 5 of these, and I put them in hot water, and it only took about 20 minutes, and they were completely rehydrated. I just let them float around in really, really, really hot water, because the thing about meat is meat will not absorb more moisture than it needs to. Okay, once it absorbs all the moisture it can, it won't absorb any more, at least not for, you know, several days, to where, you know, you can turn it to mush or something like that. But I've never let it go that long. But I've never had meat overhydrate. So that's how I did those meatballs, and it's basically the same process that I use when I do any kind of meat. This hamburger, I cooked this hamburger in the oven also, and in what I did was I took it as it came from the store, and you know how it's formed, and I simply cut it up into square sections and laid it in the pans. I cooked them, and exactly the same thing happened with the meatballs. The grease and the tallow came out of it, and of course with this there wasn't quite as much. Okay, and I rinsed them off, and then I put this meat in a food processor and I ground it, so that it was it didn't have any great big chunks in it, and it worked out just beautifully. I've mixed these little white specks in here are dried onions, so I've mixed this hamburger right with the onions, and it's going to go in the package with these ready-made meals. Okay, the hamburger, the spaghetti sauce here is just a favorite family recipe. You don't have to modify your favorite recipe, with one exception that I did, and you don't have to. But when I made this spaghetti sauce, I used tomato puree instead of tomato sauce. That made it a lot thicker. That made it so that when it freeze-dried, I was able to actually get more tomato sauce out of it, because each one of these lost about 3.5 cups of water. But because I made them with tomato puree, or this one here, this is only half a tray, so this only lost about, just over 1.5 cups of water. But the instructions that I put into it on how to reconstitute everything are going to call for 3.25 to 3.5 cups of water, and that'll make more tomato sauce with less time. So like I say, use your favorite recipe. You don't have to make it thicker. You can make it any way you want, but just make sure you know the weight of the tray before you put it in the freeze dryer, and then weigh it again when it comes out. That way you'll know how much water or moisture the tray lost. And when you write your instructions on how to reconstitute it, make sure that you only put enough water back into it to bring it to its original moisture levels. And I do that with a lot of food. I don't have to do it with vegetables. I don't have to do it with meat. I certainly had to do it with the mashed potatoes. Okay, not with, well, I shouldn't say it because I didn't freeze dry these, but I read on the box how to reconstitute the mashed potatoes, and that's what went into the instructions. Everything else, like the spaghetti, you don't have to worry about what reconstitutes. But the tomato sauce, you do. You have to worry about how much water gets put back into it, because if you don't put enough in it, you're going to end up with some stuff that's so thick you can't use it, or if you put too much in, you'll end up with tomato sauce soup. So you have to be cognizant of that. And I do. I write it down on a piece of paper, and I actually put it in the freeze dryer with the tomato sauce. Okay, and that way when I take them out, I can see what the weights were, and then I'll put the weight that comes out of it, and then I'll subtract that from the original weight, and I'll know how much water to put back into it. And one of the things that I had never thought about before was that an ounce of water by weight is also an ounce of water by liquid volume. So if your tomato sauce loses 4 cups of water, that's 4 times 8 ounces, or 32 ounces of water, liquid, 4 cups, 32 ounces. That's how much water you put back into it, is 32 ounces by your measuring cup. So you put, you know that you're putting back in the same amount of water. So don't think that you have to convert those, because you don't. 32 ounces by weight is also 32 ounces by volume. Okay? So with that, let's go ahead and I'll show you how this gets packaged up and ready for long-term storage. Okay, this is going to be fairly quick. Here I have a 1-gallon bag, and I've got the, you know, it's labeled as to what's inside of it. And then I have written out on my computer instructions on exactly how to do all of this. And of course, I write for the vegetables, I cover with hot water until soft, drain, season to taste. That's all you have to do, because these are a side dish. The gravy, prepare as per package instructions. I'm including 2 packages of gravy. Now, one thing that's important is if you're going to vacuum pack them, you want to poke a hole in each one of these bags. You don't have to, you know, poke a lot of holes, but you do have to poke a hole in there so that the vacuum will vacuum pack the bag too. And I do the same thing with these. I do close them up. I could leave them open, but I found out if you vacuum pack them, these might seal themselves up again. But I'll take my needle packer, and I'll go ahead and I'll poke 3 holes all the way through the bag, like that, so that when I vacuum pack them, this bag will vacuum pack. I do the same thing with the potatoes, I do the same thing with the Parmesan cheese, and I do the same thing with the bag. Now, I will put the meat or the O2 absorbers in with the meat. I don't bother putting them in with the potatoes or anything else, but I keep that meat with an O2 absorber, and then I'll pack them. And I want to show you, I'm not going to go ahead and waste a lot of time packing this one up. I will here after I'm done. But I want to show you, this is what it looks like when it's packed. You can see on the back side, you've got the mashed potatoes here, you've got the hamburger here, the vegetables are right here, and the Parmesan cheese is up along the side here. And I'm able to put them in there. And then this needle vacuum packer is wonderful. Okay, I built this. I designed this and built it, and as you can see, it vacuum packs very, very hard. And if you want to learn how to make one of these, I have a video. I'll put the link down below. I have another video that goes through and shows you how to make these. It has a particulate trap in it that prevents particulates from getting into the pump, and you can even you'll even catch some of the particulate in this barrel first. I just recently cleaned that out, but so this will prevent particulate from getting into your pump, and it just keeps things kind of cleaner. And like I say, it works wonderfully. And how I do that is you'll poke it into one layer of the bag and turn it on, vacuum pack it, and then you'll seal across the hole so that the vacuum packer doesn't lose its vacuum. But anyhow, there's the mashed potatoes. And here is the one with the spaghetti sauce in it. Again, you can see it. It's really easy to see. You can see the spaghetti noodles right here. You can see the Parmesan cheese kind of laid on top of those. You can see the spaghetti sauce down here. And you can see the meatballs up here and individually packaged. And I actually do this. These are half trays of spaghetti sauce. So I was able to get 4 of them out of 2 trays. But for the other 2 trays, I went ahead and put them in 2-gallon foil bags, and I put double everything, okay, but with the same instructions on how to reconstitute, and it works wonderfully. It does take time. It does take patience. You're not going to do it in one freezer load, because you have to do the meat in one on this. You have to do the spaghetti sauce in one. You have to do the meatballs in one. You have to do the vegetables. So, and one of the things that I do is I keep a lot of vegetables. If I have an open spot in one of my freeze dryer trays that doesn't have, I don't have enough of whatever it is I'm trying to freeze dry, I don't try to just space it all out because that's a waste of space. I keep a 4-pound bag of mixed vegetables in my freezer. And if I have extra space, I just fill it up with mixed vegetables. It works very, very well. And then I keep them in a gallon jar so that when I do these meal in a bag, I've always got some kind of vegetable that I can put in with my meal in a bag. So in this one again, there's the meat, there's the 2 packages of gravy, the meat mixed with onions, the vegetables, the potatoes. Now with the potatoes, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little bit of a yellow tint here. I put butter flavoring right in with the potato flakes, and I get them on Amazon. They're called Butter Buds, and I'll put 2 tablespoons in this package of dried potatoes, and it works really well. I've reconstituted them. I've reconstituted one of these to make sure that it all works. It all works wonderfully, and I'm very, very satisfied and happy with the whole thing. So with that, I'll leave you there. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as best I can. I'm quite sure I've missed something. I've been racking my brain trying to figure out some of the other questions that people would have. But I think that about does it with this. I do have I am a member of several multimedia platforms that deal specifically with freeze drying, so I do collect questions. I do see what other people are doing, and I will bring some of that to my videos here. So I hope that you'll subscribe. I hope that you like the content, and I hope that you'll share. You know, click that notification button. I think that my intent to teach you things other than, you know, showing you a picture of something I'm freeze drying and asking a lot of questions and everything, which I do on my multimedia channel. But also, I'm a professional photographer. You can see my link to my website up there. I love it when people just visit my site and look around, tell me what they think of my photography. So with that, I'm Evan Rowell, and this is Critical Thinking, about questions and answers and prepackaged meals.